Welcome back to the deep dive. We talk a lot about information security, about privacy, these big, sometimes kind of abstract ideas.
They can feel overwhelming.
Exactly. But when you peel back the layers, you find they're actually built piece by piece. It's all about specific requirements, specific techniques.
It really is. It's like engineering almost. You don't build a secure bridge with just one concept, right? You need detailed plans, specific materials, tested methods.
That's a great analogy. It's not one giant block. It's countless little bricks and wires and processes, each with its own rules.
And that's where the real work happens, translating those big ideas, those policies, into actual practice. How do you actually protect the data, protect the system?
And today we're going to crack open a really important example of that detailed rulebook. We've got sections from NIST Special Publication 853, Revision 5.
NIST 853. Yeah, that's a foundational document, especially in the U.S. federal space, but its influence goes way beyond that. It's basically a huge catalog of security and privacy controls.
Think of it like a toolkit, maybe, or a big recipe book for security.
A toolkit is good. Or a library of safeguards, really.
Yeah.
Technical ones, operational ones, management controls. Everything an organization might need to think about to manage risk.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
Oh, absolutely. It covers a massive landscape of potential threats, vulnerabilities, you name it.
No, we should be clear up front. The full 853 is, well, it's huge. We're not tackling the whole thing today.
No, definitely not. That would be more than a deep dive, maybe a Mariana Trench dive.
Right. So instead, what we've done is pull out just a few specific controls and control enhancements. Think of them as individual components from that big toolkit.
Little pieces that address very specific challenges, sometimes ones you might not even think about immediately.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack these examples. We'll look at what the requirement actually says, dig into the discussion points from the source itself, and, explore why these specific details matter.
We'll just go through them one by one as they appear in the material we have, kind of a guided tour through some of these security building blocks.
Consider us your guides, helping you navigate these pieces of the puzzle. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it. Let's unpack this.
Okay, first up, let's talk about running code. Software, right?
Yeah.
Everyone does it. But what about code you don't entirely trust?
A very common problem. You get software, maybe commercial, maybe open source. You didn't write it. How do you handle that risk?
That's where this first one comes in. It's a control enhancement, SI 715, part of the system integrity family, and it's called code authentication.
Right. And the core idea, as you said, is managing the risk when you execute code from potentially less trustworthy sources. The specific rule here is actually quite strict.
What does it say?
It says organizations must allow the execution of binary or machine executable code only in confined physical or virtual machine environments.
Only in confined environments. So wait, you get some software and .exe file or whatever, and you can't just start run it, not on your main system.
Not according to this control, if certain conditions are met. It has to run in a dedicated, isolated space.
Like a sandbox.
Exactly like a sandbox. Or maybe a physically separate machine, though that's less common now. Usually, it's a carefully set up virtual machine, isolated from your critical network, your important data.
A digital cage, kind of.
That's a perfect description. The whole point is, if that code does turn out to be malicious or just buggy in a bad way, its ability to cause harm is severely limited. It's stuck in the cage.
Okay, but does this apply to all code? Like even stuff from major vendors?
Good question. The control specifies when this strict confinement rule kicks in. It's not for everything.
What are the conditions?
It applies specifically when the code comes from sources with limited or no warranty, and ATOR when the source code isn't provided.
Okay. That makes sense. Limited warranty, no source code. That screams less trustworthy, right?
It points directly to situations where you lack transparency. If the vendor isn't standing behind it with a solid warranty, or if you can't see the source code to understand what it's really doing,
then you have less assurance. You can't easily check for backdoors or, hidden vulnerabilities.
Precisely. So the confinement, the cage, is how you compensate for that lack of inherent trust or transparency in the code itself.
You're managing the risk that comes with sort of opaque software.
Exactly. And there's another layer here, too, which is important.
What's that?
The human element. Even to run this kind of code in the confined environment under these conditions, you need explicit approval from specific organization-defined personnel or roles.
So it's not automatic. Someone has to actually look at it, understand the risk, and say, okay, run it, but only in the sandbox.
Correct. It forces a conscious risk decision. It's a crucial gate.
Mm-hmm.
Someone accountable has to sign off.
Now, the source material, the discussion around this control, adds some interesting context. It mentions this applies broadly.
Yes, this is often a surprise.
Yeah.
It applies broadly to all sources of binary or machine executable code, not just, dodgy downloads.
So potentially commercial software, too.
Yeah.
Off-the-shelf stuff, even open source.
Potentially, yes. If it meets those criteria, limited warranty, no source code available or verifiable, or if the source isn't trusted for a particularly critical function, then yes, it could apply to commercial packages, patches, firmware, open source, binaries.
So it's less about where it came from, like big company versus small developer, and more about the assurance you have in that specific piece of code.
That's the core idea. How much can you reasonably trust this code? If the answer is not much, or we can't verify, then confinement might be required, regardless of the label on the box.
So if a company uses, say, some specialized tool from a niche vendor without a strong track record, or maybe an open source component where compiling it is too complex, so they just use the pre-compiled binary,
Right.
they might need to run that tool or component in isolation under this control depending on their risk assessment. The whole point, the why, is achieving higher assurance.
Right.
You can't always build trust into the code if you didn't write it or can't inspect it. So you build trust into the process of executing it. You limit its blast radius. Controlling the environment because you can't fully control the code itself makes sense. The source also links this to another control, SA20, about custom development.
It does. SA20, which we'll get to later, is about actually building your own critical components if you can't trust any available options.
Okay.
So the discussion here points out that if an organization decides not to go down the custom development path for a critical component, maybe it's too expensive or complex,
Then this control, SI715, running the potentially untrusted commercial version in confinement becomes a key compensating measure.
exactly, it's plan B. If you can't build your own trusted version, you take the best available version, assume it might be risky, and lock it down tight.
And what other things does the source suggest doing in that scenario if you're stuck using the potentially untrusted binary?
Well, besides the confinement, it mentions layering on other protections, things like enhanced auditing.
Meaning, watch it like a hawk, log everything it does.
Pretty much. Significantly ramp up the monitoring. Also, restricting its access to source code or system utilities, making it harder for the code or an attacker using it to mess with the underlying system.
Locking down its permissions.
Right. And finally, protecting system and application files from deletion, making sure this potentially risky code can't sabotage the operating system or other important software.
So layer upon layer of defense when you can't guarantee the core component is safe.
That's the strategy, compensating controls. The source also mentions related controls like CM10, configuration management, and SE44, controlling system behavior, to show how this fits into the bigger security picture. Those controls help define and enforce that secure, lockdown environment where the untrusted code runs.
Okay, so let's bring this back to you, our listener. Why should you care about this seemingly technical rule about running code in confined spaces?
Well, think about all the software you use every day. On your phone, your computer, maybe smart home devices. A lot of that is binary code. You don't have the source. You're relying on the vendor's warranty, their reputation, their security practices. This control shows that for organizations handling sensitive stuff, that basic level of trust often isn't enough.
It highlights the inherent risk in just running programs.
It does. It's the technical justification behind why security folks are so cautious about unknown executables, why your browser throws up warnings, why supply chain security is such a huge topic now. It shows the kind of fundamental caution needed when the stakes are high.
It makes you appreciate the work that goes into protecting systems, even at the level of just launching an application, and the careful decisions that should be happening behind the scenes.
Exactly. It underscores that seemingly simple actions have complex security implications.
All right, let's pivot a bit. We've talked about code execution risk. Now let's talk about data leaving the building, so to speak. Unauthorized data movement.
Yes, data exfiltration.
This brings us to Control Enhancement SI418. It's under system monitoring, and the title is pretty explicit: Analyze traffic and covert exfiltration.
Right. So this one is all about stopping sensitive information from being secretly smuggled out of a system or network. The basic requirement is that organizations have to analyze outbound communications traffic.
Analyzing outbound traffic. Okay, that sounds familiar, like firewalls, checking traffic leaving the network, or intrusion detection systems looking for suspicious patterns. Isn't that standard practice?
It is, to some extent.
Yeah.
But this control enhancement pushes it further. It's not just about watching the traffic at the external boundary, the main internet connection.
Where else?
It explicitly requires analysis at organization-defined interior points within the system as well.
Inside the network, monitoring traffic moving between internal servers or segments. Why?
That's the critical part for catching more sophisticated attackers. The source explains these interior points could be subnet boundaries or even points within specific critical subsystems.
Okay, but why monitor internally if the goal is to stop data leaving?
Because attackers rarely just grab data and run straight for the exit. Modern attacks often involve landing somewhere inside the network and then moving laterally.
Moving sideways.
Yeah, exploring the internal network, escalating their privileges, finding the really valuable data maybe on a database server deep inside, gathering it all up, staging it somewhere before they even try to send it out.
I see. So they're doing a lot of internal prep work first.
Exactly. By monitoring traffic at these internal choke points, you have a chance to detect that lateral movement or see large amounts of sensitive data being aggregated in a place it shouldn't be before the exfiltration attempt even happens.
It's like catching the burglar while they're still casing the joint inside, not just when they're trying to climb out the window.
That's a perfect analogy. Security cameras inside the hallways, not just at the front door. And the control specifically calls out detecting covert exfiltration.
Covert. What does that mean here? The source defines it, right?
It does. The covert means used to exfiltrate information secretly. It's about methods designed to hide the data transfer, make it look like normal traffic, or disguise the data itself.
Hiding it. How?
Well, the source gives the classic example, steganography.
Steganography. Right, hiding data inside other data, like embedding a secret document inside a cat picture.
Precisely. Or hiding it in the metadata of a file, or within the data packets of seemingly normal network protocols. Basic monitoring might see a standard image file go out and think nothing of it.
But it could secretly contain stolen blueprints or customer lists.
Exactly. That's covert exfiltration. The attackers are trying to blend in to make the stolen data invisible to standard security tools.
Wow, that's sneaky. And challenging to detect, I imagine.
Extremely challenging. This control implies that organizations need to go beyond just looking at traffic headers or basic signatures. They need deeper inspection, maybe looking for statistical anomalies, unusual data patterns within seemingly normal traffic, or using specialized tools designed to detect steganographic techniques.
So it's not just firewall logs. It's actively hunting for hidden communication channels, both internal and outbound.
Yes, and that often requires pretty advanced tools, maybe even machine learning, to sift through the sheer volume of traffic and spot these subtle, hidden signals. It's a significant technical lift.
The processing power, the storage for logs the analysts needed, it sounds like a big investment.
It definitely is. It's not a simple check-the-box control. It represents a mature, proactive security posture.
Okay, so why should you, listening at home or on your commute, care about organizations analyzing internal traffic for covert exfiltration?
Because your data, your personal info, financial details, health records is what attackers are often after. And they're using these kinds of clever, covert methods to steal it without setting off obvious alarms.
So this control is about pushing organizations to counter those advanced techniques.
Exactly. It shows that good security frameworks recognize these sophisticated threats. It means organizations handling your sensitive data should be looking deeper, watching for internal movements, hunting for hidden data transfers. It's a reminder that protecting information is a constant battle against evolving, often sneaky, tactics.
It makes the threat feel more like a spy game, and this is about having better counterintelligence.
That's a good way to think about it. It's about detecting the spies operating under deep cover.
Very interesting. It shows the level of vigilance required. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. We've looked at specific code execution and data monitoring controls. Let's talk about the big picture, the overall plan for security.
The architecture, foundational stuff.
Exactly. This brings us to Control SA-17, Security Architecture and Design. This isn't about one specific threat, but about how security and privacy are baked into a system from the very beginning.
That's right. This control is fundamental. It requires organizations to define, document, and internally keep updated the security architecture and design for their information systems.
So it's like the blueprint. Before you build the house, you need the detailed plans showing where the structural supports, the wiring, the plumbing, in this case, the security features will go.
Precisely. It's the system's security blueprint. And it's not just any blueprint. The control says it must be based on organization-defined security and privacy principles.
Principles, like core beliefs about how security should work.
Kind of. Things like least privilege, defense in depth, secure defaults, the fundamental concepts guiding their security approach. And crucially, this system-specific architecture needs to be integrated with the overall enterprise architecture.
Integrated with the enterprise architecture. What does that mean practically?
It means the security plan for one system can't live in isolation. It has to align with the organization's bigger picture, their overall IT strategy, how different systems talk to each other, the main security policies for the whole company.
So if the company has a policy that all sensitive data must be encrypted at rest, the architecture for a new application has to show how it achieves that and how that fits with other systems it connects to.
Exactly. It prevents building systems in silos where security approaches might clash or create gaps where systems interact. It ensures consistency and avoids security islands.
That seems particularly important if you're outsourcing development, right? The source mentions that.
Yes, it highlights that distinction. Even if you hire someone else to build the software, outsourcing, the organization itself is still responsible for defining that security architecture, the blueprint.
You can hire the builders, but you have to provide the architectural plans and make sure they follow them.
You got it. You own the design, even if you don't swing the hammer. The source points to established principles that should guide this architecture, mentioning things derived from standards like common criteria or NIST's own systems security engineering guidance.
What kind of principles are we talking about?
Things like using formal models for security policies, clearly identifying the critical security components, ensuring the design actually meets the requirements, aiming for a conceptually simple design.
Simple design. Why is that important for security?
Because complexity is the enemy of security. The more moving parts, the more tangled the interactions, the harder it is to analyze, test, and be sure you haven't missed vulnerabilities. Simple modular designs are easier to secure.
Makes sense. Less places for bugs to hide. What else?
Structuring for least privilege, that foundational idea that every part of the system only gets the absolute minimum permissions it needs to do its job. And designing for testability, making it easier to verify security features actually work.
So this SA-17 control, demanding this architecture document, it's basically the master plan for embedding security and privacy.
It is. It dictates how security is integrated, how components interact securely. Without a solid architecture, security often becomes a patchwork of fixes bolted on later.
Which rarely works well.
Rarely effective, exactly. Architecture puts security at the core from the start.
So why should you, the listener, care about a company's internal security architecture documents?
Because it tells you whether security and privacy were an afterthought or a fundamental design requirement for the systems you use. A system built without a strong security architecture is like that house built on a shaky foundation.
It might look okay, but it's inherently weak.
Exactly. When you use online banking or cloud storage or any service handling your data, knowing the organization has a rigorous process for security architecture means they're taking the underlying safety seriously. It's the difference between just hoping the system is secure and actually designing it to be secure from the ground up.
That's a really important distinction. It's about building security in, not just adding it on. Okay, let's shift gears again. This next one is, well, it's a bit different. It touches on the physical world in a way we don't often think about with cybersecurity.
You must be talking about PE19, Physical and Environmental Protection.
That's the one, PE19, information leakage. But not leakage like a data breach through hacking, leakage through physical phenomena.
Right. The goal here is explicitly to protect the system from information leakage due to electromagnetic signals emanation.
Electromagnetic emanations. Okay, break that down. What are we talking about? Like radio waves?
Basically, yes. The source defines it as the intentional or, more often, unintentional release of information through these signals. Electronic devices, as they operate, as they process data, they aren't perfectly quiet. They give off faint electromagnetic signals.
Like noise.
Exactly. Radio frequency noise, fluctuations in power draw, sometimes even faint sounds. And this control recognizes that these emanations aren't always just random noise. Sometimes they can correlate with the actual data being processed.
Wait, seriously? So the noise a computer makes could actually contain information about what it's doing?
In some cases, yes. It's a concept that's been understood in high-security government circles for a long, long time. Think about Tempest standards, though that specific term isn't used here.
So someone could potentially sit outside a building with sensitive equipment?
And pick up these faint signals leaking from computers or network cables inside, and potentially reconstruct some of the data being processed. That's the threat model this control addresses.
That sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It really does.
Yeah.
And the source notes that the level of protection needed depends heavily on the sensitivity of the information. For top-secret data, the requirements to prevent these emanations are incredibly strict.
Can you give a simpler analogy?
Remember old CRT monitors? Sometimes they'd cause interference on a nearby radio, or how putting your phone near some speakers causes buzzing.
Yeah.
It's the same basic physics. Electronic devices emit signals. PE19 is concerned that those signals, instead of just causing static, might actually carry usable information maybe related to keystrokes, screen displays, data moving on a wire that a sophisticated adversary could intercept.
Wow. So how do you even defend against that? Lead-lined rooms.
Sometimes specialized shielding, yes. Or using specially designed low-emission hardware, filtering power lines, carefully managing the physical environment, ensuring sufficient physical distance between sensitive gear and potential listening posts. It's about suppressing or masking those signals.
This sounds incredibly specialized. Is this something regular companies worry about?
Honestly, for most typical businesses, the risk is probably very low, and the cost of mitigation is extremely high. The attackers capable of doing this are usually nation-states or similarly resourced groups. But for organizations dealing with highly classified government data, critical infrastructure control systems, super-sensitive R&D, or high-stakes financial trading,
Where the adversaries are that sophisticated.
then yes, this becomes a very real and necessary concern. It's niche, but critical in those specific contexts.
Okay, so why should you, our listener, care about this seemingly exotic control?
I think it's fascinating because it broadens our view of what security entails. It's not just about code and networks. It shows that when the stakes are really, really high, you have to consider the fundamental physics of your devices.
Information leaking out through unintended side channels.
Exactly. It reminds us that security involves managing not just logical paths, but also these subtle physical effects. It highlights the extreme lengths necessary to protect the most sensitive information in the world. It might not affect your home PC directly, but it shows the depth of the challenge for those protecting critical systems we all ultimately rely on.
That's a great point. It definitely makes you think about security in a much wider sense. Okay, let's move from the physical back into the data itself, specifically personal data. This brings us squarely into privacy territory with Control SI-19, de-identification.
Ah, yes, de-identification, a really key technique for handling personal information responsibly.
This control has two main parts, doesn't it?
It does. Part A is about the action itself. Organizations need to remove specific, organization-defined elements of personally identifiable information, PII, from datasets.
Taking out the stuff that directly points to a person name, social security number, things like that.
Exactly. But Part B is just as crucial. It requires organizations to evaluate the effectiveness of that de-identification process periodically at a defined frequency.
So you can't just strip out the names and call it done. You have to keep checking if your method is actually working, if the data is staying de-identified.
Precisely. Because the landscape changes. The source defines de-identification simply as the process of removing the link between a data set and the individual it describes.
The data subject.
Right. And it clarifies what PII includes, not just the obvious direct identifiers like name or SSN, but also things like birth dates, mother's maiden name, biometrics.
Okay.
And importantly, it also includes other information that is linked or linkable to an individual. Think medical records, educational info, financial data, employment history.
So even data points that aren't names could still be PII if combining them could let someone figure out who the person is.
That's the key challenge. A combination of, say, zip code, birth date, and gender might be unique enough in some data sets to identify someone, making that combination effectively PII in that context.
And the control says PII should be removed when it's not needed anymore.
Essentially, yes. When it's not or no longer necessary to satisfy the requirements envisioned for the data.
Right.
The example given is perfect if you're just calculating aggregate statistics, like the average income in a city.
You don't need individual names and addresses.
Exactly. So those identifiers should be removed. It's about data minimization, only keeping the identifiable bits, if absolutely necessary for the task. The source also notes this should be done by trained people.
Right, because it's not always straightforward what needs removing or how.
Correct. And the main benefit, of course, is better privacy protection. If the identifiers are gone, they can't be accidentally leaked or misused.
The source also mentions that laws and regulations might dictate specific methods.
Yes, things like EPA in healthcare or GDPR in Europe have their own specific rules or guidance about what constitutes adequate de-identification. Organizations have to follow those external requirements too.
But here's the really crucial part. The reason for that evaluation requirement, in part B. De-identification isn't perfect, is it?
No, it's not. And the source is very clear about this. It states, re-identification is a residual risk with de-identified data.
Residual risk, meaning even after you've removed the obvious identifiers, there's still a chance someone could figure out who the data belongs to. How?
The source points to things like combining the de-identified data set with other data sets, maybe public records, social media info, other breached data, or simply using more powerful data analysis techniques.
So someone gets a de-identified hospital discharge data set, combines it with public voter rolls, and suddenly they can match up enough overlapping details, age range, zip code, maybe dates, to link specific medical records back to named individuals.
That's exactly the kind of re-identification attack researchers have demonstrated many times. Seemingly anonymous data often retains unique fingerprints or patterns.
And as data analytics get better and more data sets become available, this risk increases.
It does. What was considered safe yesterday might not be safe tomorrow, which is why that evaluation requirement is so vital.
It forces organizations to stay aware of the latest attack techniques.
Yes, to maintain awareness of potential attacks and evaluate effectiveness over time. They need to periodically test if their de-identification methods are still robust against current re-identification capabilities. It's an ongoing responsibility, using techniques like anonymity or differential privacy perhaps, and constantly checking them.
Okay, so tying this together, why is SI-19 de-identification and its evaluation so important for you, the listener?
Because it's all about your personal data. When organizations want to use data about you for secondary purposes, research, analytics, sharing aggregate trends, de-identification is the main tool they use to try and protect your privacy while still getting value from the data.
It's their attempt to break the link back to you.
Right. But this control shows that good frameworks recognize this process isn't foolproof. There's always that residual risk. Requiring ongoing evaluation means organizations should be actively managing that risk, constantly checking if the data they claim is anonymous really is anonymous enough against modern attacks.
It highlights that privacy isn't just a switch you flip.
Exactly. It's a spectrum, and maintaining it, especially with large data sets, requires continuous vigilance and technical effort. It makes you think twice about any data set described simply as anonymized.
That's a really critical point for understanding data privacy today. It's an ongoing challenge. All right, for our last control in this deep dive, let's circle back to where we started in a way, back to system components and trust, but taking it a step further.
Oh, you're heading towards SA20. Customized development of critical components.
That's the one. This control addresses what happens when even running potentially untrusted code in a sandbox isn't enough. When the component itself is so critical and the available options are so suspect that you need, well, something more drastic.
It is a significant step. The core requirement is for the organization to re-implement or custom develop critical system components that they define themselves.
Re-implement or custom develop. So basically build it yourself. If there's some absolutely vital piece of the system hardware, firmware, core software, and you look at everything available in the market and decide none of it can be trusted enough, then this control says you might need to roll up your sleeves and create your own version. The trigger, according to the source, is when the organization determines certain components likely cannot be trusted due to specific threats, for which there are no viable security controls to adequately mitigate risk.
So it's not just that there are vulnerabilities, but that there are vulnerabilities you cannot fix or work around effectively with other controls. And the component is critical.
Exactly. Maybe it's a fundamental design flaw in all available network cards, or persistent backdoor worry in a certain type of encryption chip, or untrustworthy firmware in a critical controller, if the risk is unacceptable and unmitigatable otherwise.
You build your own. What's the goal?
Yeah.
Just avoiding known bugs. It's deeper than that. The source says the purpose is to satisfy requirements for higher assurance.
Higher assurance. That sounds like needing almost absolute certainty about how it works and its resistance to attack.
That's the idea. By controlling the entire design, development, maybe even manufacturing process, you have much greater confidence. Confidence in the supply chain, confidence there are no hidden back doors, confidence that it's specifically hardened against the threats you're worried about. You maximize the trust in that foundational piece.
And the source mentions the goal is making standard attacks by adversaries. less likely to succeed.
Right. If everyone else is using off-the-shelf component X, attackers will focus on finding flaws in X. If you build your own custom component Y, those standard attacks probably won't work. You've changed the target, made it unfamiliar, and hopefully more robust.
This sounds incredibly difficult
Hmm.
and expensive. Building custom hardware chips or operating system kernels?
Oh, it's a massive undertaking. Huge cost, deep technical expertise required, long development times, and then you have the ongoing burden of maintaining and updating this unique component yourself. It's definitely not a decision taken lightly.
Which is probably why the source mentions the alternative again, right?
Yeah.
Connecting back to SI 715.
Exactly. It acknowledges that custom development might not always be feasible. Cost, complexity, maybe just no way to actually build an
So
alternative.
if you can't build your own,
Then you fall back to those compensating controls we discussed earlier for managing the risk of the untrusted component you're forced to use.
enhanced auditing, access restrictions, file protection, the whole lockdown approach.
Precisely. It's that layered risk management again.
Yeah.
Ideal state.
Yeah.
Build your own trusted component, SA20, fallback state.
Yeah.
Use the best available untrusted component, but cage it. Monitor it intensely and limit its power using things like SI 715 and other controls.
It really paints a picture of security as a series of trade-offs and strategies based on risk and resources.
Absolutely. You aim for the highest assurance you can reasonably achieve for critical functions. And where you can't reach the ideal, you mitigate the remaining risk as best you can.
So wrapping this one up, why should you care about SA20, this idea of custom developing critical parts?
I think it's fascinating because it shows the extreme lengths organizations might go to when security and trust are paramount. It tells you that for the really critical stuff, national security, essential infrastructure, things protecting huge amounts of value, the standard technology powering our everyday lives might actually be considered insufficient.
It highlights that sometimes security requires going beyond software patches and configurations, right down to the silicon.
Exactly. It's a testament to the fact that when facing sophisticated adversaries and catastrophic consequences of failure, organizations are willing to make massive investments to build bespoke, high-assurance solutions. It gives you a glimpse into the deep end of the security pool where trust is built, not just assumed.
A very powerful illustration of high-stakes security.
Wow.
Okay, that was quite a journey through just a handful of these controls.
Yeah.
We went from, rules about running code
Yeah.
to designing the entire security architecture
From hunting hidden data transfers inside the network
to worrying about signals leaking out
to
physically.
the complexities of data de-identification and privacy.
And finally, to the idea of building critical components from scratch for ultimate trust.
It really covers a huge range, doesn't it?
Yeah.
These examples from NIST 853 show just how detailed and, frankly, how complex building robust security and privacy really is.
It's definitely not just about having a strong password policy or a firewall. It's about addressing very specific risks at multiple layers: technical, physical, procedural, architectural.
It shows that these aren't just abstract concepts. They're implemented through these granular controls, each designed to tackle a particular piece of the puzzle.
That's the real takeaway, I think. Security and privacy are built from these specific, thought-out requirements. So, here's something to mull over as we wrap up. Thinking about all this data potentially leaking via physical signals, the challenge of truly de-identifying data, the need to monitor inside networks for hidden threats. Does that change how you think about the devices you use or the services you trust online every day?
It definitely makes you appreciate the hidden complexity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What unseen challenges are lurking just beneath the surface of our digital interactions.
It's a fascinating question. We hope this deep dive today has given you a clearer picture of some of the building blocks involved in security and privacy.
Yeah, hopefully it sheds some light on the details. Keep exploring these topics.
Absolutely. There's always more to learn. Keep digging deeper.